If I could welcome Tim and thank him for the presentation he's about to give, as well as Drucilla Cornell will follow him. Tim is a former colleague of mine. He was a member of Parliament, opposition side, a spokesperson on finance. He then went on to become responsible for attracting investments into the city of Cape Town, and now is the CEO of Wesco, which is the investment and trade promotion agency for the Western Cape province as a whole. So he does a number of other things. Sits on the board dealing with called the Silicon Cape, and he was a parliamentary councillor to the then leader of the opposition, who also happens to be in the audience, Linda Masabuka, sitting in the back in the last parliament. So Tim will give the main presentation, and he'll be followed by Drucilla Cornell, who I'll introduce when her turn comes. So over to you, Tim.
Thanks, Mr. James. And thank you very much to the organisers of the conference. I left home 24 hours after I landed at JFK. I had Doha and Manchester, bizarrely, to get here, but it was definitely worth it. It's a very beautiful part of the world. Thank you very much for having all of the South Africans here today. I'm glad that Prof. Berkowitz gave the introduction to the theory that we're considering here. And Annandale is sort of expressed in this book that he wrote 15 years ago. And I once met Annandale. It was in 2005. I was working as an economics researcher for the opposition party in South Africa, which was chaired by Dr. James Ndiwe, my great friend and former parliamentary leader of that party, as Dr. James has said, has joined us here today. But at that point, I didn't think that ideas came better than Fernando de Soto's ideas. I mean, they were incredibly simple. His idea was incredibly simple. It was optimistic. It was market-led, but it was pro-poor. And it placed the onus on individuals to lift themselves out of poverty if their unrecognized assets were incorporated into the property system like government. So this guy was a rock star as far as I was concerned in the economic policy space. And by the way, I'm talking from a paper which it's a short paper that I've drafted. There's a couple of copies at the front desk if you want to get into the numbers. But I remember going up to him a little bit starstruck when I saw him in the streets in Cape Town. And he told me that he had just met with the president's wife. So Thabo Mbeki was the president at the time. He said he just met with Mrs. Mbeki, and he was talking to her about coming to do some of his consulting work in South Africa. And I wasn't surprised to hear this because Mbeki had this analysis that South Africa consisted of two economies. There was the developed white economy, as he called it, and then there was the undeveloped black economy. And I mean, you can say what you like about the way he expressed it, but I think, as Dr. James showed, the economic inequality, the income inequality situation in South Africa, although there has been improvements, or rather there hasn't been improvements since the dawn of democracy, you've actually seen increasing racial inequality between groups and within groups. I think there was something to be said about his analysis. It definitely was a way of describing what was going on in South Africa, and I thought Fernando de Soto's ideas provided a very neat way of trying to bridge the divides that you still see today in South Africa. So a couple months after I bumped into Fernando de Soto, we saw the ANC publish a paper called Development and Underdevelopment. It was drafted by quite a reform-minded minister, who was the deputy finance minister, Jabu Moleketi. And in this paper, we've heard a little bit about GEAR, the Growth, Employment and Redistribution Strategy. Now, GEAR was tabled in 1996, and it did succeed in stabilizing South Africa's macroeconomy, drew down debt, and bought us fiscal space. What was interesting about GEAR is there were a whole lot of other ideas of GEAR tabled in 1996 about microeconomic reforms. And they just simply weren't implemented because almost all of them were enacted to the trade unions who are in this alliance with the African National Congress. But now in this paper that was published in 2005, Development and Underdevelopment, suddenly you saw these micro policies appearing here. There was talk of labour law reform, of establishing export processing zones, of reducing red tape and reducing the compliance burden on small business. So these were very exciting to us sitting in the opposition because they were generally in line with the kinds of ideas that we were lobbying for in Parliament. And then there was this idea of Hernando de Soto expressed incredibly clearly right at the heart of the paper. And what was interesting is a few months later, an initiative was launched by Thabo Mbeki's deputy called the Accelerated and Shared Growth Initiative that took these ideas and took them further, proposed that they be included in national economic strategies. So in the mid-2000s, you had this very welcome return to the kinds of reforms that were never implemented in the first 10 years of democracy, and at the heart of them was Hernando de Soto's idea. So we as the opposition welcomed these developments. Hernando de Soto also welcomed them. He said they were endorsements of his theories. And of course, the trade unions and the South African Communist Party, we still have a Communist Party in South Africa, who's also in alliance with the ANC, they threw their toys up the cart. These kinds of market-based reforms were unacceptable. And in fact, Thabo Mbeki's departure, I think the seeds of that departure were sown in the proposals that were tabled in the mid-2000s. Because the campaign against him became an ideological campaign. What was interesting is the figurehead that the unions chose to lead that campaign, Jacob Zuma, was an entirely ideology-free zone. Jacob Zuma has no binding ideology of his own, but as an opponent of Mbeki, someone who Mbeki had fired from his position as deputy president, he was a very useful head for that campaign against Mbeki. And he beat him in an ANC internal election in December 2007. And then less than a year later, the ANC recalled Thabo Mbeki from the presidency and paved the way for Zuma to become president. And those ideas of Jabu Moleketi's, the ideas in the Accelerated and Shared Growth Initiative, the ideas of Hernando de Soto were taken off the agenda. Now, Mbeki was politically vulnerable for a lot of reasons. He had a strange, almost paranoid leadership style. He had these bizarre positions on the AIDS crisis, on the political situation in Zimbabwe, and he really fumbled the way that he removed Jacob Zuma from the deputy presidency. But I think if you look back now, 5 years later, you'll see that it was actually his willingness to embrace these reforms and put them back on the economic agenda that eventually became the basis of the campaign at Thabo. So certainly there's a link between this idea we're discussing of Hernando de Soto's and the fact that Thabo Mbeki is not there, that Jabu Moleketi is serving on private sector boards, and that this legal title reform has not really been on the ANC's agenda in the past 10 years. But of course, I spent 10 years working for the opposition party who drive this idea very strongly in Parliament. Now that I've read that intro, I'm going to cover very quickly these sections that are all sketched out in the paper. We've covered the place of legal title reform in South Africa's policy works. I want to talk quickly about how in South Africa, how we've tackled housing since 1994, and then how the opposition party, where the party I work for is in government, has dealt with housing. And then I want to dig into the experience of the legal title experiment in South Africa, and most interestingly, the experience of title around houses that were transferred to individuals under the housing program, and then consider what we could be doing to make titling more effective in South Africa. So you'll understand that South Africa's modern property system is about as old as the US is. In about the 1600s, we had European settlers moving to South Africa, ignoring traditional ownership by indigenous peoples and setting up individual freehold title. Very similar property system to what you have in this country. And of course, in South Africa, that kind of sentiment continued through apartheid. And in 1913, the apartheid government passed an act called the Land Act that defined where South Africans could live and which South Africans could own land on the basis of their race. And I think if you visit South Africa today, you can see the legacy of those policies too. But of course, market forces and human ingenuity meant that those policies were unenforceable. And over time, the apartheid government eventually allowed tenure but not ownership when black South Africans close to urban centers because they needed that labor supply. And in the end, in the 80s, the system broke down and you had large-scale informal settlements forming all over the country. So in 1994, Mandela came to power leading the ANC, and the new constitution that was drafted committed the government to providing, or rather, to this right that South Africans have to adequate housing, and committed the government to realizing that right over time, so tackling the right to housing over time. And when Mandela came to power, you had an estimated backlog of about 2.1 million houses. So we were short about 2.1 million houses. And they implemented this program under the Reconstruction and Development Program, or RDP, to start building these houses. The way it would work is they would given a developer a subsidy for building houses, drawn down as the milestones of those houses, the building process were achieved. The developer could draw down a subsidy, and then that house was handed over to the person who needed the house. And over the past 20 or so years, we've seen 3.3 million houses built in South Africa. Now, it's really an extraordinary achievement, and it's one that the opposition acknowledges. And today, 25% of houses in South Africa are those subsidized government houses provided over the last 20 years. But of course, housing is a moving target, because now we went from 21 or 2.1 million houses short 20 years ago. We now have 2.3 million houses short. It's because of urbanization, because of population growth, and because of the complexity of our housing delivery system that gives it as a mandate to national government, to provincial governments, to the equivalent of our states, and to the local governments and the municipalities. It's a shared mandate between those governments. It involves 16 different government grants. It involves 18 of the 36 government departments, an incredibly complex piece of government. And that complexity has led to the point where housing delivery is about half today what it was in the early days of democracy. We've had an erosion of capacity, we've had some poor planning, and really the easy, large-scale projects close to the cities have been done. And now the attention needs to turn to the more difficult projects, and that's starting to show in the rates of housing delivery. Plus, we've had such slow growth, as Dr. James sketched out earlier, that it's starting to squeeze the revenue that's available to spend on housing. I think when we look back on South Africa's democratic history, we will thank the relatively federal nature of our system for a lot. Because in South Africa, as a political party wins a city, they get real influence over the infrastructure of that city. If you win a province, you get real influence over education, over healthcare, and both of those governments give an opposition party essentially the chance to demonstrate their chops in something like housing. So in 2006, the DA, the party that I represented in Parliament, took control of Cape Town for the first time. And in 2009, took control of the Western Cape province where Cape Town sits, one of the 9 provinces of the country. So really this base to start to deliver or show that the party is stronger in government than the ANC, and particularly on the housing question, trying to implement some new ideas to speed up housing delivery and make it more effective. Because on reflection, there's been an obsession with those numbers in housing, because they're in the millions, at the expense of the quality. So you saw millions of houses being built with such bad quality that the estimates now is it's going to take about $5.8 billion US just to fix the houses that were built. So that's one lesson that we learned and took into government as a party. Secondly, many of the houses that were built, these are new houses built by the democratic government, look a lot like the old houses built by the apartheid government, because there were these kind of sprawling matchbox type houses over large distances, and most importantly, far from city centres and far from opportunity. And then there were some interesting design challenges around the way the subsidy was designed. So the subsidy is available to you if you earn up to $350 as a household. But you can only start getting a commercial mortgage to build a house or buy a house of your own if you earn more than about $1,000. So what that means is that there's a gap. Really poor people can get houses. People with a relatively good income can go to the banks to build their own house. The people in between are left. We call it the gap in the market. And gap housing is a particularly big problem in South Africa. So coming into government at the city and provincial level, we started to rethink how we deliver housing. We started delivering what's called sites and service, which is when you don't actually build a house, you give someone a site, you can be entitled to the site, and you provide the belt services, water, electricity, sewage to that site. And the onus is on the individual to build their infrastructure. We started upgrading the informal settlements that you can see in the top of that picture to build the infrastructure and give people legal title to the land that they're sitting on already. We started working with communities to develop more housing. We started trying to design cities better so people were closer to opportunity. But I think given that you have at the city and provincial level a relatively modest ability to influence the kinds of top-level policies, ideas like this have, even within that constraint, helped deliver the best housing in South Africa out of the West of Cape and the City of Cape Town. So you've seen the City of Cape Town accelerate housing delivery from 2,000 houses a year to 9,000 today. And you've seen the province with a similar performance building about 120,000 houses in the past 5-6 years. Now, we're getting these houses built, but what is the experience with legal title in those houses? I think there's some very interesting insights here, because about 1.1 to 1.4 million of those households that received subsidized houses from the government don't have the title deed to their properties. They estimated between 30 and 50% of subsidized house owners don't have legal title. So how did this happen? Well, the first thing was a policy change that is detailed here. In about in 2004, 2003, under such pressure to deliver houses, the government changed the way the subsidy was allocated and said, as a builder, you can get the subsidy before you hand over the title. Simple change like that. They were trying to get more houses built. But what it means is the little bits of the subsidy that you get when you finish the housing development and hand over the title is not enough of an incentive for the developer to work on the title matter. So many of them just walk away and leave that money on the table because they paid most of the money leading up to the point where they built the house pre-title transfer. There's some problems around the developers not fulfilling the application process to get legal title for a house property. Many beneficiaries simply don't bother to go to the municipality to collect their legal title. So there's piles of legal titles to houses sitting in the municipality that are uncollected. And because of these policy changes, because of these failures in the program, you started seeing houses being delivered, so people had tenure, but they don't have the legal right to that house. Then there's also this restriction: if you're a recipient of a house, you can't sell it within the first 8 years by law. So what that means is a lot of people are incentivized to sell the house informally because they need the money, they want to realize their asset, but they're not legally allowed to do so, so they sell it illegally, and of course the new owner can't get legal title because they bought the house illegally. So what's interesting is you have this huge asset transfer experiment, one of the largest in the world, but increasingly we are unable to provide this magic formula that DeSanto says we should be providing. I think there's some relatively simple fixes here. We can fix this policy matter that allows developers to take the subsidy without delivering the title. We need to fix capacity and the deeds office in the local government level. I think we should investigate something the city of Cape Town is piloting, which is something called a certificate of tenure. It's not full legal title, but it's a first step towards legal title that allows citizens' ownership to be recognized by the city and could potentially be a step towards the conveyancing process that leads to full title. And I think ideas like this would be able to help us to match title delivery to housing delivery in the future. National government has realized this, and they've quite bizarrely asked the Estate Agents Affairs Board to come up with a strategy around legal title. Now, this is almost definitely not the right structure to do this. These are the guys that regulate estate agents. And I personally don't have a lot of hope that that's the right body to help us rethink how we do legal title. But it is something that where we were in government, Dr. James has really expressed, we seized upon this and said, how do we get more title into the hands of the people that are sitting on these properties anywhere? And there's been some success. The numbers are actually better than the ones you put up earlier. We've now got the title deed backlog. It was 36% of houses without title, down to 23%. We've issued 31,000 legal title documents since 2009 in the Western Cape province, and we've implemented, where we govern, policy reform to make sure that legal title has to be delivered in order for a developer to get the subsidy. So I think we've solved some of the policy problems that led to this huge drop-off in title. But now, once someone has a house from the government, and once they have title, what actually happens? It's just also right about doing this incredibly powerful effect to create wealth and tackle poverty. We've got some really interesting surveys that have looked at this, and they've identified some serious benefits to people who have the legal title to it. They've discerned that they are incredible social assets. They provide an inheritance to children, they provide a basis for a community support system, and a psychological impact on someone who now has the title to a property and vests them in a community. They have economic benefits. A lot of these houses are used as spaza shops, as small shops where you can sell goods informally. They're used as creches. The space is rented out. This is a creche run out of somebody's house in South Africa, so there's a track record of there being economic assets. As financial assets, there's less evidence. About 6% of subsidy houses have been sold. So there's a couple of reasons for this. The lack of housing stock nationally means that if you sell your house, you're unlikely to find another one if you're in that income bracket. And a lot of these sales have been informal because the complexity around a formal sale disincentivizes that process. On the rental side, they estimate that about 70% of subsidized houses are no longer lived in by the people who were given the legal title. They essentially rent them out to people with jobs, and the unemployed people who got the house go back to living in the shadow. So there's a really interesting dynamic around the rental aspect of the house as a financial asset. The last one is capital raising, and this was really Annandale-on-Hudson's idea. If you have this asset, you can use it as security to raise funds to start a business or to start to work your way out of poverty. What's interesting is about 8% of subsidized properties have been used to raise a mortgage. That's about 120,000 houses since 1994. I think it's a very small number. What's encouraging is that it represents a about $2 billion in mortgage that was raised, and does demonstrate the beginnings of some the influence of Annandale-on-Hudson. So, but the question is, why isn't that number higher? Why haven't more people been able to realize the value of their assets? I think part of the answer comes down to education. I sat down with the head of housing in the city before I came here. I sat down with the advisor to the Minister of Housing in the province, and I said, what's the story here? They said, well, some people don't even realize that they have an asset. They think they just have a house. They don't make the connection to being something that they can utilize in the way this sort of theorized. Others said that they understand the intrinsic benefits of the asset, but not how the asset can be leveraged. Then there's perhaps a cultural explanation. It's that the house is viewed in a South African cultural context as being the family's house rather than an individual's house. Or the fact that the house has a cultural value that outweighs the potential financial value. There's some interesting explanations there. But I think the major one is the bank's unwillingness to lend to people who are sitting in these houses, primarily because they have money. You can offer the house as security for a loan, but that's a necessary but not sufficient requirement for getting that loan. Because if you can't service the loan because you have no job and therefore no income, then the bank's not going to give you the loan. So as the head of housing in the city told me, homes without jobs are not worth very much. And I think that's probably the biggest explanation for why you're not seeing the sorts of ideas playing out across this grand asset transfer experiment. There's also some academics who are saying, well, Vincent already explained that his personal experience with having his first house. And I think what you saw was many black South Africans getting a house for the first time. It was the first significant financial asset that their family had ever had. And I think the lack of a social, of a financial safety net beyond that asset meant that it really hiked up the risk if you took a loan on that house and it was repossessed by the bank. And that acts as a disincentive too. So what can we do to try and take this idea of Annandale-on-Hudson and fix some of the problems around the idea to make it more effective? Some researchers have proposed we need a functioning secondary property market. We need more affordable housing stock. People need to be able to afford the finance repayments on the borrowing that they might do. And the mortgage lenders need to be willing to move down market into that gap market. I think there's some truth in that. And the bottom line for me is that legal titling is not a silver bullet. You can't just suddenly give people legal title and expect them to live themselves out of poverty. You have to tackle these other associated reforms first. And my last section is just about the latest ideas. 15 years since DeSoto wrote this book. It's been highly contested in the last 15 years. I think South Africa has a really interesting test case of how his ideas are not as easy as perhaps they might have seemed to be when he described them very powerfully 15 years ago. And there's some very legitimate opposition to these ideas inside. We've got a shack dwellers movement that opposes legal title entirely on principle because they believe title should be communal. We have some new proponents of legal title too. There's a think tank called the Free Market Foundation that is working themselves to give people legal title to the properties that they're sitting on. They call it Kaya Love in My House, and they're working to, as a private entity, re-establish the title link to property ownership. So, and this is happening right now. It was launched at the end of last year in South Africa. So there's some proponents and some critics emerging today in the country. At the city level, the city of Cape Town is doing some interesting things. What happens in our experience when you deliver someone a subsidy house, you build it with a backyard part. In almost every case in Cape Town, that backyard gets filled with 1 or 2 shacks. And then the homeowner rents out those shacks to secures the rental income from those shacks. Now, what this does is it removes backyards, but it also demonstrates how people are very eager to leverage their house as an economic asset. the cities changed their perspective on this. We've said, well, in government, the city said, let's recognize that this is going to happen. Let's regulate those dwellings. Let's give people title to the dwellings that they build in the backyard of a subsidized house. Let's supply services directly to those units that are built. So there's been a whole rethink very recently on how we design these houses to be able to deliver services and titling to those backyards, as they call it. There's also a very strong focus on working together with the private sector more and making sure that our city is densified. One of the biggest problems or legacies of apartheid is the huge effect that transport costs have on people who are located many, many miles away from opportunity. So there's a great case study here where this house is built on the site of what was a subsidized house. So one person was given this house. It's in a place called Dunoon, which is up the west coast in Cape Town. And the developer took down the original house and built this unit that I think had 6 or 7 rooms in it. And the rental income from that unit is equivalent to some of the most expensive properties in Cape Town, because you have such a concentration of people living here. You basically have a single family in every room. But what it is achieving is the densification of the city. It's putting people closer to opportunity, and it's this incredibly organic private sector initiative that's just emerged. And the city is going to start giving a grant to these developers to formalize what they're doing, support what they're doing, in exchange for applying building regulations and codes to these units that they're building. So it's a great example of the private sector stepping in to fix a market failure and helping us build a more efficient, diverse city. So the bottom line is, legal titling is not a silver bullet. We need a set of other reforms in place before it becomes effective. Most importantly, in the South African context, we need people to have jobs. We need to achieve the economic growth to create the jobs that we need so that people have the income to be able to leverage their house as a financial asset. I think that's certainly our experience in the city up until now. But I think that $2 billion of funds leveraged off the back of RDP houses is an exciting indication that there is value in this idea if we can solve some of those broader reforms to unleash the mystery of capital as an enabler. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Tim. I said to Tim, your presentation, 15 minutes please. He gave me 29 minutes and 55 seconds. So, but thank you very much for that. It's a powerfully factually based presentation and review, and it's cut. And Tim is directly involved both in the governance side and the idea side. So thank you very much. What you heard is an evidence-based factual review of current policy direction. It's germane directly to a better understanding. Thank you. If I can now introduce Drucilla Cornell to you. She's a professor of political science, comparative literature, and women and gender studies at Rutgers University. She's also been a National Research Foundation chair in customary law, indigenous values, and the dignity jurisprudence at the University of Cape Town, and that came to an end in 2009. She's the founder and director of the Ubuntu Project and the author of Law and Revolution in South Africa, Ubuntu, Dignity, and the Struggle for Constitutional Transformation, and the editor of Ubuntu and the Law, African Ideals, and Post-Apartheid Jurisprudence. So thank you very much to you, Drucilla, for doing this. The same applies to you.
I think I'm going to follow Lewis and just talk from here.
That's fine.
And I think today, not surprising, given that I've run a project called the Ubuntu Project for the last 12 years, is actually rethinking property through Ubuntu. South Africa needs a thoroughgoing examination and restructuring of its neoliberal economic policies, and certainly one aspect of this process has to be creative, new ways to think about land distribution, agrarian reform, and the very meaning of property. The ANC famously promised to return 30% of the land taken from the black majority notorious 1913 Natives Land Act, which appropriated more than 90% of the land for the white minority. This program has been a colossal failure, with 6 or 7% of the land given back, and the lack of programs of support for black farmers, often leading to the inability of black farmers to maintain those farms. The ANC followed a proposal of the World Bank that 30% should target commercial farms. During apartheid, those big commercial farms were heavily subsidized by the state, something that Gordon pointed out. Now under neoliberal policies, that is not the case, and so of course many farms that are sold under the so-called willing buyer, willing seller program fail for lack of enough government support. Although my focus is not on agrarian reform, a question that must be taken up in South Africa, but rather on Ubuntu, freedom, and property, it needs to be noted that the Soto himself does not address agrarian reform adequately, taking as a deep background of his program the continuing necessity for the desertion of the rural areas to the cities, exactly what Karl Marx associated with the primitive accumulation of capital and the proletarianization of the peasantry. In South Africa, the need for a proletariat for the gold mines, discovered in 1886, was resisted every step of the way by small farmers, amongst others, leading to the violent wars that have even made the Zulus and their war against the British the stuff of Hollywood. As a great Marxist theorist and socialist activist, Rosa Luxemburg has argued that horrific history of primitive accumulation in South Africa is exemplary of the brutality of colonization, which for her was inherent in capitalism, but could only be ended in a socialist transformation of the economy. At one time, the ANC agreed with her. So whether one is a socialist or a social democrat, or whatever one's political view is, we need to have a carefully developed policy of state support that must be part of agrarian reform and land distribution. And these in turn cannot help but be tied in South Africa to the struggle for decolonization. Simply put, as many theorists in South Africa have pointed out, the struggle against apartheid must be seen as part of the project of decolonization, which apartheid is understood as just one form of colonial domination, the imposition of a particular form of unfree black labor. Colonization began long before the discovery of gold, leading to economists. Saint-Pierre Blanche argued that there are 8 different periods of the establishment of unfree black labor patterns as an edifice of colonization in South Africa. They are as follows: slavery in many patriarchal households, the indentureship of cousin children in the households of the Cape Colony during the 18th century, the system of Lord Culloden of indentured labor applicable to almost all the coast of 1809 to 1828. The first version of black repression, a system designed for the employment of coloreds, formerly coastmen, slaves, and Africans as cheap contract workers in the agricultural sector, 1841 to 1974. A second version of black repression, a system designed to turn Africans still living in the native reserves and self-sufficient farmers into cheap migrant labor for the war market. And next, discriminatory measures institutionalized from the end of the 19th century onward to protect white and mainly Afrikaner workers against competition from the already proletarianized and therefore cheaper black workers. A third version of black repression, a system designed for the employment of Africans still living in the native reserves as migrant labor and foreigners in their own land in the manufacturing industry in urban areas. The system was institutionalized under apartheid. The growing unemployment of blacks, especially Africans in the formal sector of the economy since 1960, and the growing underemployment from the informal sector, according to Saint-Pierre Blanche, this can be regarded as an aid unfree black labor pattern, and it is this pattern and how to correct it, which to my mind is the focus of this conference. As I've already suggested, my basic contention is that the meaning of property cannot be separated from decolonization. It should have to include, as I've already said, a program of land distribution and agrarian reform, as well as a new understanding of property. One crucial aspect of decolonization is that respect is not the foregrounding of philosophies, indigenous philosophies, including Ubuntu, which were disparaged, if not ridiculed, under colonial rule, should now be brought to the fore and brought seriously as entering into these policy debates and offering us different ways of thinking about freedom, property, and obligation. So we need to move on to ask what and how does Ubuntu help us think about property. For purposes of my talk today, I want to emphasize three aspects of Ubuntu. First, in Ubuntu, we're born into a web of relations that come with ethical obligations to others as they are obligated to us. Famously, at birth, in Xhosa and Zulu traditions, the baby's umbilical cord is buried, and the place of burial marks the beginning of one's journey to become a person. The achievement of singularity is always a project. Umutu, Gamutu, Gabantu. You are because I am, and I am because you are. Cannot easily be translated into the English language because Xhosa is not an adjective, noun language. It's much more active than that. But points to how we are only allowed to become a unique, flourishing person through the support of others. And how many feminists have been saying that now for the last, I don't know, 600 years? The web of relations, after all, how did each one of you get into this world? Mommy. And that's a lot of labor. The web of relations is not just a social fact, but comes with moral and ethical obligations which others also have to us. One for all and all for one means something here. And it's not about what we think of as altruism, as opposed to individualism. Second, and this is the way the debate has been framed in analytic philosophy, and I would point you to Tom Nagel's excellent book, Altruism, and Partiality and Impartiality, but basically, given the kind of individuals we are, we can only reach out to others as a form of altruism, and maybe about 1% of the population do it. Second, the web of relationship underscores both our fragility and our interdependence. It is, in other words, better understood as a theory of trans-individuality or individuation, rather than a rough and ready theory of individualism, which underlies so much of the Anglo-American defense that private property has integrity to freedom. But this said, that Ubuntu does not deny the importance of individuation or the value or the ideal of freedom. Third, the Emeritus Justice, Siobhan McCarr, who is the patroness of our project, has argued that Ubuntu is an African principle of transcendence. Usually in common parlance, we think of transcendence as pointing us toward a beyond to our world of everyday relations. But here transcendence is what pulls us out of our biological humanness. This is why Nagel doesn't think we can ever quite get to altruism. Towards our unique destiny and towards our obligations to others. This aspirational edge of Ubuntu is that it's an ethical notion of our humanness. And it is this ethical aspirational edge that is unchanging. The very notion of transcendence in Ubuntu keeps it from being static and conservative conflict, as some of its critics have argued. Our obligations change as the web of relations in which we are embedded changes, which is why Justice McCarr, Justice McCullough, are adamant that there can and must be an Ubuntu defense of gender equality as well as the rights of gays and lesbians and transgender. So to summarize, what Ubuntu is not in terms of some of the recent debates in the United States. In terms of the community-individual debate in Anglo-American philosophy, the community is not something out there as opposed to individuals. We must be protected from it as fundamental to individualism, or to whom individuals are so embedded there's no meaningful or even desirable individuation as some more extreme communitarians have argued. We become a unique person because others have been there with us and for us. We become individuated as a life project. As we will see shortly, possessive individualism, to use C.D. McPherson's telling phrase, runs counter to the central insights of this intellectual tradition. Secondly, freedom and obligation are not opposed. Indeed, we are only free in an ethical community than in relation to others. So freedom is neither lack of constraint, which under Ubuntu would be a fantasy, or its trendier terms, constant resistance to hegemonic or dominant modes under which shall go. Ubuntu, of course, is irreducible to European philosophy, but there are European traditions that have similar ideas on the relationship of freedom to ethical relationality, and to understanding freedom is tied to abnegation, not opposed to. Hegel in particular is one of those thinkers to think of freedom as a limit on property and property rights. But I want to start first with Kant briefly. In Kant, the only time we can be free is if we lay down a law to ourselves in which we claim our autonomy. And there's only one law that can do that, and that's the moral law. And why? Because it's only when we take ourselves as possible nominal selves who can actually act under the kingdom of ends, and to think of what is in the best interest of all of us under the kingdom of ends, that we can possibly have freedom. Everything else is part of us being in the phenomenal world. In the phenomenal world, we all take moral holidays. We take moral holidays all the time. But we might just be able to act as if we could put ourselves into the kingdom of ends, and then say, what is the freedom that would be valuable to me as a moral being, not as a biological being, not as an entrepreneur, as a moral being. And that freedom is the only freedom. Everything else is tied to who we are, basically as animals in the country. It's our rationality that gives us our dignity. The person who ran with this idea was John Rawls. And John Rawls said there are only two principles of justice, whether you agree with them or not. The first is liberty. The second is equality, equal opportunity, and the difference principle. And the difference principle said the only inequalities that are justifiable, particularly when you put yourself under the kingdom of ends as a moral individual, are those inequalities that serve the worst of. And what did he say about property? Property is low level. Property as an institutional arrangement doesn't even reach the level of justice. And in that, John Rawls fundamentally disagreed with Kant. But some people, many Kantians, would argue that when Kant wrote the Metaphysics of Morals, he had stepped away from his critical philosophy, including my comrade Roger Wilmot. The second is Hegel. Now Hegel seems to be a big defender of property, yet most left-Hegelians say he's the most severe critic. Why do we need property in Hegel? We need to flourish. We need to externalize ourselves in objects. We need to be able, if I draw a picture, to say, hey, Drucilla drew this picture. Or if I made a pair of shoes and I give them to Roger, I'd say, hey, Roger, guess who made those shoes? Well, you know, as I was bragging last night, my daughter draws a book cover. Guess who made this book cover? My daughter. Isn't that really cool? You know, so that's why we need property. But that's only the beginning, because what gives us property is a just state, that Hegel has stated right. So slowly we learn that property rights have to be limited on all levels. Because if we just stayed at that level of ownership, we would never reach the ethical community, which is understanding that we are part of a state that gave us the right to property, gave us the right to contract, and therefore the state can limit it. All right, I don't much like Hegel's argument that it's when we die for the German state that we truly reached our freedom. But what he did say is that anyone who gets stuck by thinking that ownership and freedom are integrally connected misses the only freedom we really have is in relationships of reciprocal recognition in which I recognize you as an I, as a moral and ethical human being, and you recognize me, and it's only in a community that we can possibly establish it. Is there some place for property rights in Hegel? Yes. Is it going to be limited in every way? Yes. If Hegel is a thinker in property, he is a social democrat, at the very least. Now, Karl Marx then comes along and says, well, what actually happens in capitalism? How many of us are really drawing pictures and putting our name on it? How many people are left making shoes and putting our name on it? Go into a factory. I worked in factories for years. I was a dye sorter. I sorted 8,000 dye, and I had no idea what I was sorting, and I didn't get to put my name on it. That's Karl Marx's point. There's no flourishing in being a dye sorter. Trust me, I did it for 3 years, and I can testify to it. Now, why do I bring this up? Because we have to see, then, that the connection between freedom and property, through, say, Thomas Hobbes and John Locke, they too even emphasize use and flourishing, although they come out at a very different level. What's freedom, then? In Hegel and Kant, it is moral and it's relational. I just want to return briefly, then, to how Ubuntu enters this picture. In a famous case that dealt with the inheritance rights of women, as well as the very meaning of inheritance, the relationship between property, Ubuntu, and inheritance was exclusively discussed. Bea held that the Black Administration Act should be found unconstitutional, and the Interstate Succession Act should replace the impugned section of the BAA until Parliament had a chance to act. Court also found that the right to succession of the firstborn son, incorrectly described as primogenitor in the written customary law, violated the Equality Clause, Section 9, and the Dignity Clause, Section 10. In his dissent, Justice McCover argued that the living customary law, driven by values like Ubuntu, should be developed under its own terms and not simply struck down, to be even temporarily replaced by a view of inheritance that is antithetical to the values of the living customary law. At stake in the debate was not the issue of gender equality, or whether women should now inherit the responsibilities as heirs. It was instead that the living customary law should be allowed to develop in accordance with its own values and not move according to those values from a system of gender trusteeship to gender equality. I'm going to leave out the quote from Justice McCover because of time, so we can discuss it in the question and answer period. This system could move to accommodate gender equality because what it could not accommodate was the idea of inheritance based simply on property ownership. As Justice McCover argues, inheritance and succession in the living customary law are completely different rationalities in terms of their view of the division of the state and the very idea of property ownership. In African living customary law, the main matter is not the division of the property of the deceased. In agricultural societies, succession had as its primary goal the maintenance of the family, and one who succeeded the deceased did not inherit property, which was often owned in common. The word owned is not really appropriate here. Held in common. He inherited the responsibility to take care of all of his family and to make sure of their well-being was maintained. The emphasis on mutuality goes completely against the notion of possessive individualism and the integral connection between freedom and property ownership. It is just the same old colonial thinking that advocates for private property as against the system of values such as Ubuntu. They can actually promote new and creative ways to think about land, its distribution, its use, and I want to turn to those now. First, the question of the nationalization of the gold mines. That has to be faced. It has to be faced because the Economic Freedom Party has put it on the agenda. The Economic Freedom Party has returned to the original ANC program, which calls for the nationalization of the mines, the constitutional amendment of Section 26, which protects the right to private property to allow expropriation without any compensation. This is not the only solution, however. The other is to adopt the formula of Salvador Allende's government that paid some kind of compensation, but on the basis of excluding what were called surplus capital gain under a theory of unjust enrichment. He got the best economist in the world before he was brutally murdered. As a primary resource, the United States doesn't like having the corporations expropriated. If you do that, unfortunately, you're usually going to end up dead. Which I don't think is a particularly just way to proceed in terms of democratic debates of a democratically elected president. As a primary resource, and that for me, that's my first September 11th, the day that Salvador Allende locked himself into his office with his AK-47 that he promised Fidel Castro he'd never have to use. As a primary resource, the public ownership of gold mines would allow for wealth creation that would help fund the rebuilding of infrastructure destroyed by the 8 periods of unfree black labor I have just described. The Economic Freedom Party has also recommended 25-year custodianships rather than ownership in accordance with the idea that what is important in property is its use for human flourishing, a la Hegel, probably not using Hegel. I just want to tell a brief story of the Ubuntu Women's Project. We wanted to have a custodianship, but we didn't have the word. We wanted land in Caimande, the Ubuntu Project has a deep roots in the township, to build this women's center, and we wanted supplies given us by the government. We did not want to own it. No one wanted to sell it. No one wanted to make a profit on it. We were feminists and womanists who wanted to build a center that would create economic empowerment as well as other goals for women. We funded 2 projects. The sewing project was very successful, and the vegetable growing project, which is how I got interested in agrarian reform. And we got blocked, because every time we tried to come up with a different way of using land, they said, well, the professor can get a loan. But the professor didn't mean it. The professor didn't want to get a loan. You know, I hate being a joke. My grandmother told me she never got a credit card. You know, and so I didn't want a loan. I hate having a loan on my house. We wanted this to be a different way of using property. Custodianship is a good way of thinking about that. Should all property be turned over to custodianship rather than ownership? Not at all. You know, there's no reason to think that people can't have titles in their houses if that's what we as a democratic society think is important. The Swiss economist Hans Christopher Binswanger called it this research group the sweeping reforms of ownership of property in the Swiss Constitution, many of which have now been passed. And these would be a good place to start the discussion of some of the reforms prevented by the Economic Freedom Party. One, distinguishing between property for use or disposal, such as what we do, and turning the latter over to the local authority of the state, which is what we want. That Kayamanda actually be the quote-unquote holder of the land. Property for use would be subject to public regulation. Property would be divided up in this way in urban and rural settlements, and property for disposal would be turned over to newly formed public owners associations. This is what we ultimately wanted to do with the sewing group. The vegetable garden is just going to be a self-sustaining, helping to create healthy nutrition for the women and for the community. They weren't even going to sell it. They were just going to distribute it for free. I mean, guess what value? Ubuntu. But the sewing collective, we hope, would actually be a business and would make profits, yes, but it would be collectively distributed. Either consisting of all inhabitants or the overseers, but allowing the inhabitants to have a democratic say. So the idea of the sewing collective is it would be run collectively and democratically. If, under the Swiss reforms, a more traditional notion of property ownership was to be maintained, they suggested the following reform: retaining a comprehensive concept of property, but having the state or local authorities restrict freedom of use. Maintaining the guarantee of ownership, but restricting the freedom of disposal by local authorities. Adopting state regulations on ownership so that legal entities can only be owners in the public interest, and that only restricted ownership of housing and building land is allowed, related to the proprietorships. Property, in other words, has to be thought through a conversion of self-interest of the possessive individual into a notion of life and the common good. This is particularly the idea of the vegetable garden. That can be thought through the value of Ubuntu. Such conversion would also, for example, immediately end the GATS negotiations with the WTO, setting the means to privatize public services. What is clear is that decolonization is a macro project that includes all aspects of daily life. Again, back to what you said, Lewis, about what does it even mean to build a black bourgeoisie is a political question. Nelson Mandela famously said that gear was non-negotiable. That in a true democracy, all aspects of daily life should be turned over to the constituent power of the people. If not, democracy, as it has in my mind in the United States, becomes an empty slogan, and the program of decolonization cannot proceed. But how can we begin this conversation? Obviously, this seminar, for which I'm very grateful for Aggie setting up, well, when it started. But in 1999, Santa Karen Blanche and Ramon moved on Dominic, called for Justice and Reconciliation Commission to begin a democratic conversation over economic reform. In 2009, after the uprisings that took the lives of many foreign workers, the three of us called for it again. And I'd like in my conversation, once again, I call for a Justice and Reconciliation Commission and the entire reconsideration of the macroeconomics of the subject.
Well, thank you very much, Drucilla. Let me just say we've got 20 minutes. And so I really want to open this up to more comment and questions. But I'd like just to say that we have to remember that South Africa's founding doctrine, established in 1994, is a negotiated settlement. And it was led by Nelson Mandela, negotiating with the apartheid government to get an agreement. The ANC didn't have the military capacity to defeat the apartheid government. Apartheid government lacked the legitimacy to be sustainable in the future. It was a stalemate. It's not an evolution in the classical sense of the term, and therefore the poverty regime was not turned upside down. It was a negotiated settlement. And the deal was everybody kept what they had. Any change had to be evolutionary, funded by the proceeds of growth. That's the deal. Okay, and so it's like the dividends don't come in, you've got trouble with the deal, which is what we're doing. So I wanted to say that we have to remember that. The second thing that we have to remember is that, and I think John Rawls is the most relevant philosopher on this talk, that part of what had to happen, John Rawls, part of what had to happen was restorative justice as a result of dispossession. And I think that the settler colonial analytical framework is actually inappropriate to South Africa for reasons we can discuss historically. But what had to happen was that when it came to land dispossession, in particular, that there had to be the application of the principle of restorative justice, which is what you see through land reform and land restitution and group areas restitution. In the case of my father lost his house twice, okay, through group areas dispossession. And therefore, in my particular family, that asset was taken only twice. And in a sense, we never recovered. And so the whole question of restorative justice is right. And then distributional justice, in the sense that John Rawls used the term, is that the least advantage must always benefit the most from the application of social policies. And so, and the issue we're trying to sort out here, policy-wise, has to do with increasingly access South Africans who were dispossessed before to assets, real assets, and not to keep them in bondage, a social welfare state. So one of the classes of assets is housing, it's land, it's stock, the shares, it's education and job experience. Those are the classes of assets. And what Tim addressed was the question of housing. I mean, we have a nation of unhoused people, and you cannot continue that way, and therefore we need practical solutions to that question. So, as a frame in terms of what it is we have to deal with in South Africa, is create jobs, give people access to assets, house them, and make the economy grow along the way. And that's the policy challenge that we have to. So thank you very much to Drucilla for commentary and reflections, philosophical, and putting some of those issues on the table in terms of how it think about some of these issues. I mean, I disagree profoundly in some respects of what you're saying, but that is the nature of a conference and a debate. And thank you to Tim for giving a very practical outline based on the new ideas that have emerged in South Africa in a policy environment where we have to govern and have to apply policies in a way that actually is meaningful for South Africans. So I'm sorry, I didn't mean to ramble, but I just needed to say that that's the framework. So any questions? Check.
Tim, part of your talk was about an unformed asset market for housing. Talk a little bit more about the underlying banking system, what might have to be changed in order for that asset market to work better.
Okay. So what's interesting about the example that I put up at the end with the units being built in Dunoon, where they dismantle the RDP house and put up a house or a set of flats informally with up to 12 to 16 rooms, is that those are being financed, but they're being financed by informal credit providers, not the banks. What you see there is the demand for housing is so high in that area that people are prepared to rent a room for their family. And you can get so many rooms on that plot that there's a market. And the people lending the money make back their money. But this is unregulated, informal funding. And it's not something that the banks are prepared to consider, perhaps because of the structure of South African banking. I mean, it's an oligopoly, essentially. 4 or 5 large banks that control the vast majority that control the vast majority of banking. And their cost structure is rather high. So if I look, the little bit I know about how some of the houses over the past few hundred years were built in white communities in South Africa. They were built with building societies or really kind of mutual, community-based, much smaller, lower cost funding entities that helped tackle the particular set of conditions around housing funding. Those have gone. Those have all been absorbed into the large banks. And I think what you see happening in Dunoon probably opens the door to whether it makes sense to reconsider that as a model. But certainly it's only happening informally, it's not happening formally. And I think it's because the banks are so large and so high cost that they can't make it work. So the question is, how can we take what's happening informally? We're regularizing it from a city context in terms of regulating the buildings that are happening. But how can we, it's a really interesting question, how we can take the informal funding that's on stream and perhaps formalize it through something like a building society like was done over the past few hundred years. But I think as difficult as it might be to get your head around building a unit, flats with 15 rooms with a family in each room, in a way that's exactly what Cape Town needs as a first step in becoming a modern, dense and cost-efficient city. So we think the seeds of this quite bizarre sounding private sector initiative are actually the seeds of a solution for Cape Town.
I have 2 hands on the way. Can we take the vote? Okay.
Thank you. I have a question about the housing and labor markets. This is the housing project in Cape Town. Has the government tried to also build factories or produce employment near the new development? Because we see there is a close link between ability to get a mortgage. So do we have any attempt to link the two? And the second question is about the trajectories to home ownership. Whether there was an option of renting for, let's say, 5 years and then deciding if you want to buy the property. That is, the family will make the decision. Company is incentive to see if this is the right decision for a family of low or middle income. Okay.
So, before you answer, something the gentleman behind you, let's take that question.
So a question both for Tim as well as Wilmot. In terms of the recent State of the Nation observations that were made in South Africa around foreign ownership of land and also potentially an acceleration of the redistributive justice that was commented on, how do you feel this affects, the foreign investors looking at the country and getting nervous in terms of being able to provide capital for the economic growth, as well as just the concern amongst residents of a kind of Zimbabwe-style, mass redistribution of land, which is very ineffective.
Thank you for that. Someone there, Drucilla.
So the question about whether it's been government policy to try and get industrial development in areas where the houses are already is a really interesting one. It hasn't happened sufficiently. It's a relatively new idea, unfortunately, 20 years after democracy, and the city of Cape Town is kind of pioneering what they call development corridors. So recognizing that because of this apartheid spatial planning, people are distant from opportunity. There's a couple of things you can do. You can make sure that public transport links them to opportunity cheaply and efficiently. I think increasingly you can connect them to opportunity digitally, so that the city is very focused on rolling out fiber infrastructure to try and connect people to opportunity that way. But then you do need to, as you say, start to bring opportunity to them. So it's amazing, actually. I only joined the city administration. I left Parliament and worked with the mayor's office for a year. And I couldn't believe that this stuff wasn't done for the last 20 years. But it is definitely on the agenda now. And the idea is that you use investment incentives, you use the way you roll out infrastructure to get development along corridors to try and link people to opportunity. It's 2 particular corridors that have been identified, and they will essentially bring jobs to the people along those corridors. So that is thankfully on the agenda now. On the kind of staggered approach to allowing people to rent first and then eventually get ownership of an asset. I think if there's a lesson in South Africa's housing approach for the past 20 years, it's that this sort of grand, let's build millions of houses and transfer them to the owners as fast as we can. It didn't work. It didn't take into account the individual realities. It didn't give enough options to people to choose the situation that suited them. And I think you're seeing that coming through in national policy now, a more graduated approach, and a recognition that we weren't doing it right. Although you can't argue with 3 million houses in 20 years, it's quite a legacy to leave. There's certainly ways over the next 20 years to deliver those better, including more different types of options in a particular site. So we're working now, actually as a government, much more proactively to take large sites of government land and say, we're going to put in mixed-use developments here. We're going to get developers to build subsidized houses. We're also going to build flats for rental. We're also going to provide land with incentives to businesses to set up. So it's actually a more interventionist approach, but I think it's a lesson that's been learned over the past 20 years of just rolling out millions of houses, that isn't sustainable or particularly well designed. Wilmot, I'll leave the foreign ownership question to you, I think.
No, don't do that.
Okay, then very quickly,
I will say something about it, but...
So I was sitting, I wasn't in Parliament anymore, I'm now running an investment promotion agency, and as someone who thinks about what investors care about, it was a pretty bad week. I mean, my email inbox was full of people who were seriously alarmed. What was unfortunate is that the way it was handled and communicated. I think if you're going to put forward a proposal like that, especially in the context of this is Southern Africa, that investors are particularly skittish, that Zimbabwe is to the north, you really want to make sure you communicate it clearly. But what happened is this idea was floated by the President in a speech. He spoke about foreign ownership of land, created all of this alarm, and then a week or two later he clarified, oh no, we were only talking about agricultural land. And oh no, we actually only meant that they can't buy, foreigners won't be able to own more than a certain amount of agricultural land. So actually what they were talking about was a relatively benign idea compared to a very explosive idea of banning foreign land entirely, but that was what HUB was interpreted in the beginning, and we suffered through 2 weeks of uncertainty and market transits that were entirely unnecessary. So I guess the lesson there is you need to be much, much clearer when you're proposing policies, sensitive policies like this. I don't know if you have a view from the House.
I will say something, but just have a go.
One of the most important things that I'm trying to emphasize is that all economic questions are ultimately political, and they have to be decided politically. And they have to be decided democratically, and anyone who says that the whole economic system is taken out of the democratic agenda is assuming that there's some natural laws of the economy, and I completely reject that idea. And this is why, and not only in South Africa, in Brazil, in Venezuela, in Colombia, there's all sorts of new ways of thinking about property, including around indigenous values. President Santos has just returned all the land to the Mamas, who don't believe in private property, don't believe in irrigation, don't believe in email, don't believe in telephone, and it's going to allow them, as long as they don't insist on having guns, to run their whole part of Colombia and govern under their own values and ideas. Now, this is something that is not a utopia. It's not Zimbabwe. It's done by a democratically elected government trying to have a peace process to end a 50-year war in the state of Colombia. So what I'm suggesting, more importantly than anything else, is that we think about property and freedom philosophically. We think and get over our idea that there's any sort of thing of natural laws of the economy, and we take democracy seriously. And we look at the macroeconomic picture. And I want to say something about the negotiation. As you well know, Chris Haney completely disagreed with the negotiation process as it was processed. There were other people, there were other ideas on the table. The direct election of a constituent assembly by demanding immediately that blacks be given the vote. Chris Haney was assassinated. He joined the Communist Party and then left the ANC because he felt that too much was being capitulated in the negotiation. It was a negotiation. But how much had to be capitulated is a judgment call. It's a judgment call. It may have been a very tough judgment call. There were all sorts of people who were saying that way too much was being conceded at the time. And those voices continue to be heard in South Africa, because they should, because it's a democratic discussion. Anyone, and this is where we're probably together, who thinks that the current policies of the ANC are effectively working, if you want to use John Rawls' to take the most disadvantaged and make them more equal, they are obviously totally failed. And there's two ways you go about it. One is you want to reconsider democratically the entire microeconomic picture. The other is that you try to proceed on a more microeconomic level. Because of decolonization, for me there is no way other than to face the macro level and to face it with all the brutality of foreign expropriation of property. There are so many creative things going on in the world now, starting with Salvador Allende, about how to expropriate that just doesn't go to nationalization versus non-nationalization. And they're all over South America right now. And there's a reason for that, because colonial domination destroys indigenous population. That's why the Mamos are getting their land back. Destroyed them, exterminated them. This kind of violence is not something that we can just simply walk away from. For those of you who are lucky enough not to be U.S. citizens, I know, because I'm a Spinozist, that I am responsible for the horrific death of Salvador Allende. Even though I was out protesting when the planes were bombing his castle. We can't escape that kind of responsibility. But the brutality of what white Europeans have done to the world, we need to take that on, and that's why I'm calling for a Justice and Reconciliation Commission with beneficiaries of this kind of unjust wealth finally get called to the table, including myself.
Okay, on the question of foreign ownership of land, I mean, it's a misguided policy entirely. Normally what you would want to do is encourage foreign investment by giving people some preferential access to, in some respects, to land. As you see, if you look at what Mauritius does, for example, it doesn't even offering citizenship for people if they invest X amount of money and the security of 10 years. Security of 10 years, when it comes to intellectual property rights and the land rights are crucial. And the fact is that South Africa requires massive foreign investments. We don't save, so there's very little domestic savings to draw on, and so the mobilization of capital. South Africa is to grow, it requires that. And so what we require is a balanced land policy, and there's been enough money for land reform, and it's just been misadministered by the ANC on a wide scale. There's also a lack of ideas, because nationalization is a blunt instrument. I mean, they nationalized the Zambian compromise and drove it to its edge and destroyed it entirely. So their nationalization is an old-fashioned post-Second World War idea. We need some new ideas, And the fact is that we need to be really creative and really smart and very innovative in terms of getting the job done. What we want is not to wallow in the sense of being victims at all. What we want to do is build a South Africa. We want to build a successful country. So it's about building. And for me, the guiding light has been Mandela's project. Because Mandela was also a modernizer. He was a very smart modernizer. He knew how to take traditional communities along with him. But he was a modernizer. Including giving individual title to common tenure land, except for grazing land. And there's some close discussions with him and with people part of the Ford Foundation funding at the time, the land reform project as it was initially set up. So the question is that we always come down to the question, what is the answer to jobs? What is the answer to quality education? What is the answer to housing our people? What are our practical policy questions? And the ones that we are interested in are the ones that are constitutional, follow the rule of law, and actually work in practice. And so I think, and for that you need to constantly evaluate policy. You have to constantly evaluate the factual evidence that you have before you to make smart policy as we go along, because nobody's perfect, nobody has all the answers. And so, in conclusion to the session, I think it's been a lovely session, but we've had Tim's presentation, followed by Drucilla's comments and critiques and reflections that grounds it philosophically. I think it was very productive.
I asked you a question, a very practical one. Can I, when the DA over to mandate a Justice and Reconciliation Commission?
Those are my closing comments. So,
What a politician.
but what was your question?
Would you support in Parliament, Sami Nairnbanks and I went, and have the Parliament establish a Justice and Reconciliation Commission? I'm asking
No, but
you,
you've already
can
had-
Sami and I win you over to this idea,
Yeah.
the DA?
No, what's required is not another commission. What's required is a series of workable practical policies, and we are persistent with those policies over the long haul. We've had a Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and that's very forward. So, to answer your question very directly.
We like direct answers. There's going to be a lunch for those of you who are registered for the conference down the hall. We'll go from about 1:30 to 3. Paul Collier, who unfortunately was late today, is going to be here. He's going to give a keynote address at 3 o'clock, so I hope you all get some lunch and come back at 3. And then Greg Mills will give a final talk from South Africa live at 4:30. So we'll have 2 more discussions this afternoon at 3 o'clock with Paul Collier and 4:30 with Greg Mills. Thank you all very much. Have a great lunch.